So much has been made about Judas over the thousands of years. There's lots of theories about who Judas is, why he did what he did, what motivated him. And I'm a believer, always have been, that more than one thing can be true at the same time. And I think that that's kind of what we know about Judas. We try to look at Judas and say, this is what it was, and this is why he did it. We try to have this horse blinders on, this myopic view of, no, it had to be this one thing. And I think we fall short in that, because I do believe that there can be more than one thing true in any moment. For example, in Luke's gospel, Judas is hardly mentioned. He was just a run-of-the-mill disciple. Until really at the very end, suddenly in chapter 22, verse 3, the words that are written are that Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. So essentially, you've got this run-of-the-mill guy who didn't bother anybody for the bulk of Jesus' ministry, and right in the end, he winds up having Satan enter him, and then, and this is where the phrase comes from, we have the idiom that often gets used, the devil made him do it. So he's just a normal guy until the devil made him do it. That's actually in stark contrast to how John's gospel is written. In John's gospel, throughout the gospel, Judas is called the betrayer, that he is the one who betrays over and over and over again. He's the betrayer. So it is as if Judas, from the very start, is the one who was bad, always, which is different than how it's portrayed in Luke. And that doesn't really help our perspective on Jesus. All the leadership gurus who write all the leadership books Jesus would get a failing mark for choosing the wrong guy to be in his inner circle. As a leadership principle, you hire the right people. You don't hire one that's evil from the start and who's eventually going to betray you, right? This picture, just to give you some reference, is from Leonardo da Vinci. It's that famous scene of the Last Supper that spreads all the way across the screen. And this is a zooming in on the character that we know to be Judas. And you can see, because remember, Jesus predicts the one who reaches in the bowl with me. So you see his one hand reaching, his left hand, and then his right hand is doing what? It's clutching the purse. And so that's how we know that it's him in that painting. Well, in Mark's gospel, Judas is spoke about regularly, but Judas is never referred to by his, what we would say, surname. He's never called Iscariot. And what we widely believe, scholars believe that Mark was written first, maybe even by like a whole decade, and that Matthew and Luke both had copies of Mark while they were writing their gospel. And so it's odd and begs the question, why on earth is Judas not Iscariot in Mark's gospel? Well, one comes to the conclusion that perhaps they just added a last name because for a decade anybody named Jude or Judas was getting interrogated for being the one, right? But there's also theories that have developed around that. There was actually a sword-wielding group of bandits, zealots, if you will, hyper-religious folks, and they were called the Scari, which in the original Aramaic, Scari and Iscariot seemed like they were similar words. And so some people, especially in the recent last couple hundreds of years, biblical scholars have believed that perhaps Judas was part of this rebel movement. And that rebel movement wanted to overthrow the government of the people of Israel at the time, knowing that it was corrupt, but also they wanted to overthrow it because they wanted to get the Roman occupation out, and they wanted to establish a new government that would be more faithful, more restrictive, more strict. And when Jesus let them all know, I'm not going to be that kind of king, I'm not going to be a political king, that then Judas had Jesus turned over as the powder keg spark to try to spark the revolution. So that theory that perhaps Judas was an over-anxious zealot, he was well-meaning but terribly misguided, that's where that all came from, was this word Iscariot that is actually absent in Mark's gospel. In Matthew's gospel, the last of the four, Matthew just sees Judas as a money grubber. He's always mentioned as the one holding the purse. There's that story in which perfume is spread on Jesus' feet, and Judas complains about that because he was the one who held the purse and he wanted to have that purse increase. He wanted more money in the bag, if you will, because he was basically a white-collar criminal who was skimming off the top. Now, I'm a believer that more than one thing can be true at the same time. And so maybe he was skimming in a part of the zealot movement. Maybe he was skimming and was bad from the start. Who knows? For me, the why Judas did it is so much less important than how he did it. That's really the significant thing. We get so mired in the other details. The more significant thing is how. Just as a reminder, how did he do it? How did Judas betray Jesus? With a what? With a kiss. That's right. He betrayed his friend in the most intimate way he possibly could. You know, he could have stood at the end of the garden and went, that guy. But he did. He could have walked into that little group and then walked back out and said, you know, the guy with the loose sandals. You know, he could have said something, but he went up to him and he kissed him. The most intimate way to demonstrate their closeness. And that had to hurt. That had to be problematic for us. Now, William Blake was a 19th century poet and philosopher, visionary. He said this. This is a great statement. You can go to the next slide. That'd be great. He said, it's easier to forgive an enemy than to forgive a friend. I want you to really look at that and really think about it. It's easier to forgive an enemy than forgive a friend. Man, I see a lot of evidence on both sides of that. I see a lot of folks covering for their friends. I think there's a lot of folks who, you know, write things off for their friends. But again, maybe covering is different than forgiving. So let's maybe think about that. And I also see a lot of folks vilifying people who are different than them that they don't have to interact with. So we vilify the people that are unfamiliar to us. We make them enemies. But again, whether or not that has to do with forgiving a wrong, again, that's a different question, I guess. But I also see it as a pastor, when you're betrayed by someone who's very, very close to you, really, really betrayed, how's that feel? That is really hard to forgive. And the pain of that is terrible. And it is onto that backdrop that we see this story. The pain of an intimate break that is so hard to forgive. Well, our series, Broken And, continues. And again, we're talking about being broken open. Probably not the best story to have Judas be the broken open. Because when we talk about being broken open, we talk about, as I showed in the children's message, something new. Like we're broken and then we become something new. Again, you can't make an omelet without breaking an egg kind of thing, right? And yet, Judas never becomes anything new. He's broken open for sure. He's rendered. Matter of fact, in the retelling of this story, which happens not in the Gospels, but in the book of Acts, which was also written by Luke, the retelling of this story, when he hangs himself, he bursts open. His bowels actually burst open. So I guess, Judas is the right guy to talk about being broken open because he physically was. But he never makes it. He never realizes becoming something new. I always want to encourage looking at the betrayals together, how they parallel Peter and Judas. Both betray, both fail, both sin, both regret what they've done. But then Judas actually gives up on the whole process, so focused on himself, he just gives it up. Where Peter actually focuses on God and what God wants him to do and actually becomes that, heads the church the way he was encouraged to do so. Well, this series, we've been talking about brokenness and we've been decorating with broken mirrors. And they demonstrate the brokenness in life. And as we walk with Jesus to the cross, we see every single person he encounters as being broken and then acting out their brokenness only to break Jesus. And we see all of the brokenness illustrated around us. Well, there was an essay written about 10 years ago by this woman, Barbara Brown Taylor. She's an incredible theologian. She's an Episcopal priest. She's mostly retired. She doesn't write as much anymore. She's in her 70s, and she yet has written some really influential theology. Matter of fact, women's groups, especially women's Bible studies, study Barbara Brown Taylor, and her writing is impeccable. But years ago, she wrote an essay called The Perfect Mirror. And in a minute, I'm going to put up a quote that I'm really going to want you to study. But she writes about Jesus being the perfect mirror. And she borrows from John's gospel that theology that somehow Jesus was killed because he was this perfect mirror into the world. Let's take a look at the quote. Jesus died because he told the truth to everyone he met. He was the truth, a perfect mirror in which people saw themselves in God's own light. I'm going to read that again. I really want you to, if you take nothing else out of today, take this out of it. Jesus died because he told the truth to everyone he met. He was the truth, a perfect mirror in which people saw themselves in God's own light. This is what Jesus did, especially in his walk to the cross. Every single person that he met saw how broken and inadequate they were, and it created a visceral and negative response that cost him his life. And, again, we don't like Lent. And why don't we like Lent? Because Jesus suffers and he dies and it's violent, and why does he have to do that? And I understand that you don't like Lent because of that. That is true. But what can also be true at the same time is, perhaps we don't like Lent because in the midst of Jesus loving us, in the midst of his being broken, in the midst of his loving us, even though we are broken, we see how inadequate we love. That Jesus in Lent is the perfect mirror shining on us, showing us how much of a failure we are. And that's hard. The good news is that even though Jesus is this perfect mirror, demonstrated here by all of the broken pieces of this mirror, that mirror still shines. it still reflects. It still captures our essence. It still reflects light towards us. Well, that's a great thing. The goal is not to be like Judas, so filled with self-loathing that we become incapable and we fail. The goal is to be like Peter, who when we're broken, we're actually broken open to become something new. Ernest Hemingway, the great writer, once said this: "We are broken. We are all broken. That's how the light gets in." I pray that as you wrap your brain around your own brokenness, your own inadequacies in the face of our amazing God of love, that you will allow yourself to be broken. That's what Lent does. It drives us to our knees. It breaks us. Why? So that we can experience God's light shining in, and so that we can then become the mirror that shines God's light into the world. I pray it be so. Amen.